Whilst in Texas, Keyes was paying close attention to news of Samantha Koenig's abduction. He was amazed by public contributions toward the case because the total amount was rising by the day. By this time, weeks had passed and everyone assumed that Koenig was still alive, chained up somewhere because the ransom was yet to be paid. According to Keyes, this was the most media coverage that one of his victims had ever gained. He was hooked on the case and he kept up to date with it, leaving comments on articles that I'll later get onto. Also, he looked up and monitored the weather situation in Anchorage. This was to ensure that he knew what to expect once he returned. Having landed back in Anchorage in the early morning hours of Saturday, February 18th, Keyes and his young daughter made it home. At some point, Keyes checked on Samantha's corpse in the shed. He claimed not to have done anything on the day that he landed or on the Sunday. On Monday, Keyes' daughter went off to school. Without a doubt, Keyes needed privacy. Therefore, whilst his daughter was at school, he went to his shed. Keyes attempted to remove Koenig from the sliding cabinets, but because she was frozen, the sliding doors only partly opened. As a result, Keyes took apart the cabinets, lights and an air conditioner. Everything was eventually chucked into landfill and Keyes managed to remove Samantha's body from the cabinet. Later that night, Keyes rolled Samantha out in a tarp, and because she had bled from her stab wound, the blood had leaked into the tarp and shed insulation. At one stage, some of Samantha's blood dripped onto the shed floor and Keyes became paranoid about this detail, proceeding to wipe the blood from the floor with a paper towel. Furthermore, he made the decision to burn everything that he could, most of it being done in his fireplace at 1 or 2 AM. The only things that Keyes kept were Samantha's makeup, phone, debit card and some loose change. Keyes mixed this change in with some of his own. Samantha was rolled onto a piece of clear plastic visqueen sheeting. Keyes claimed to have thawed her body out. He had assembled a wooden table and stapled more visqueen plastic around the shed. I imagine that his shed would have looked like Dexter's kill room. Keyes had Samantha out on the table. Her limbs were tied with ropes. Her arms were screwed to the wall. When asked what he did next, Keyes didn't seem very open to sharing. However, he did acknowledge that he had committed the grisly paraphilia known as necrophilia. By now, it was late into the next morning and Keyes had lost track of time. Undoubtedly, Keyes narrowly missed being caught because his daughter came to the shed to get him. Keyes laughed to himself as he relived the close call moment. He told his daughter to go back inside and eat her breakfast. Since Kimberly was coming home on Wednesday, Keyes knew that he needed to get rid of Samantha as soon as possible. Not only did he want to get rid of her body, but he also wanted to begin buying things for his ransom plot. So therefore, Keyes went out shopping in Anchorage. Firstly, he found a typewriter and some paper. However, finding a Polaroid camera was proven to be a struggle. Keyes would return home and do a quick online search, which yielded him some success. Later on in the day, with his daughter beside him, he would drive to Target to pick up an in-stock camera. However, there was no film in stock. As a result, Keyes did another online search and learned that some was in stock at a Target in Wasilla, Alaska. With time ticking away, Keyes made it to the Target in Wasilla and purchased a pack of film. Alongside this, he was also looking for a sign to a lake. He wanted to scope out a lake to dispose of Koenig's remains. Keyes admitted to having read the map wrong as he couldn't find the lake on MapQuest. He had searched up the lake at least 3 times on his phone, but it was getting dark by this point. To make matters worse, black ice on the roads made driving conditions terrible. Unable to find the lake, Keyes eventually drove back home. It should be noted that in the early morning hours, Keyes would pick up Kimberly from the airport. For the next couple of days, it was business as usual. Keyes had work stuff to do and waited for Kimberly to get back to her work schedule. Either that, or to go out with friends at night. Keyes was particularly concerned with Kimberly becoming suspicious of his behaviour. He would admit to having come up with an excuse for why he'd been in his shed for many hours over the course of 3 or 4 days. This explanation was because of past events which had created distance between them both. Along with this, Kimberly often popped up to see Keyes whilst he worked. In the next week, Keyes would visit Walmart and purchase makeup, fishing line and needles. He found a bunch of newspapers in a dumpster behind cars. He picked the February 13th edition for the Ransom photograph. Kimberly was out of town, all with friends one evening, when Keyes made it back to his shed. It was night time when Israel began applying makeup to Samantha. who was still in the shed on the wooden table. Samantha's face was slack, with Keyes trying to make her appear more alive, but this was proving difficult. Having applied a lot of makeup to Samantha's corpse, Keyes then took a test picture with his Polaroid camera and applied even more makeup. By this time, he had already braided Samantha's hair. Keyes said that there was more to the braiding, but he didn't elaborate any further. When everything was finally done, Keyes said that roughly 3 to 5 hours had passed. He would take another photo before cutting the edges off the Polaroid photo. After this, he scanned the photo to cover his tracks. Keyes mentioned that there were easier ways that he could have done the ransom plan instead of running all over town looking for a Polaroid camera. When everything was finished, the makeup was burned in the fireplace and more items from the shed were also burned. Meanwhile, Samantha remained on the table, still tied to the wall in the shed. At this stage of the interrogation, Keyes was asked more about the ransom note and his following of the Koenig story. At the time, he said that he was curious to see what would happen. Unlike with many other offenders, Keyes somehow didn't believe that he could be traced through ATM transactions. He may have misheard the question, but if this was his honest answer, it surprised me. When further asked about the ransom note, he mentioned that he'd waited for everyone to be out of the house before typing it up. He made misspellings in the note but didn't deliberately do this. In the note, he made it sound as though Samantha had been sold as a sex slave in Mexico. The Fur Rondi festival was taking place and Keyes was the designated driver for Kimberly and her friends. It was the perfect time for Keyes to be out, because he'd be travelling all over town. In a parking lot, he sent a text from Samantha's phone to her family, directing them to the ransom note, which he'd placed behind a missing dog poster at a local park. Whilst everyone was drinking, Keyes got curious about whether or not police had intercepted the message and found the ransom note. Indeed, they had cordoned off the area and were now investigating. To avoid drawing suspicion to himself, Keyes kept on driving. Not long after sending the text to Samantha's family, Keyes decided to dispose of Samantha's body. Keyes disconnected the ropes attached to Samantha and rolled her body off the table before disassembling the makeshift table. He dismembered Samantha, using wire as a tourniquet to reduce the blood. According to Keyes, this only took a few minutes. He then triple bagged Samantha's remains. Keyes had asked his friends who worked for Fish and Game about lakes. He didn't initially want to use Matanuska Lake because it was too small. Days before he died, he had confessed to using lakes to get rid of other victims. I'm guessing that he knew what to look for and wanted something very familiar. Keyes ideally wanted a really big lake. However, the other lakes were too far north, so Keyes settled on this one. He would make multiple trips up to the lake in order to dispose of Samantha's body. In addition to this, he wanted to fish. So, he set up an ice hut, chainsawed through the ice, checked the depth of the lake with some weights, and then disposed of some of Samantha's body. Having got done fishing, Keyes got rid of the ice hut and covered the hole up with some snow. By this time, he'd forgotten to attend a meeting at his daughter's school. This was to place his daughter in a gifted and talented program. Investigators seemed concerned by Keyes' two sides. Despite missing the gifted and talented program meeting, Keyes seemed proud of his daughter doing taekwondo after school. You could sense that he was proud of her succeeding in school and was happy about the gifted and talented program. Investigators must have been concerned by his ability to remain calm and composed following such a sickening act. He could just return back to regular life without a care in the world, showing love and compassion for his own daughter, yet such a lack of humanity for someone else's. It would be learned that in the coming days, Keyes disposed of the rest of Samantha. To wrap up the interview, Keyes was shown and asked about comments that he had left online. Israel was a heavy drinker and lacked recollection when it came to leaving comments online. This is mostly because of this alcohol consumption. Around this time, he was seemingly obsessed by the case and was up into the early morning hours reading news stories, drinking, and impulsively leaving comments under his own name. Like many killers, Keyes gained intense psychological gratification from leaving comments on victim articles and stories. He only recalled leaving one comment, when in reality, he had left quite a few. The comment that he recalled was one about Samantha's name having not been put onto Crime Stoppers. In the comment, he'd mentioned that the FBI hadn't yet added Samantha to the National Missing Persons database. To Israel Keyes, everything was a twisted mind game.